Once upon a time, there was a boy.
I loved animated movies from an early age, and I sort of dreamed of making my own comic books or animated movies when I'd grow up.
Who wanted to tell stories a whole new way.
Jordan was a master in game design.
He rotoscoped his brother's movements.
And created a tale of a prince.
Jordan managed to create such deep emotions
that ushered in a new age of gaming.
Prince of Persia is also kind of considered one of the first action-adventure games. Sands of Time, unfortunately, it didn't really translate into the blockbuster sales that was expected.
This is the story of the Prince of Persia series. At a young age, Jordan Mechner discovers what will become his lifetime passion.
I loved animated movies from an early age, and I sort of dreamed of making my own comic books or animated movies when I'd grow up.
In 1979, a new computer from Apple gives him a chance to make his dreams a reality.
When I was in high school, the Apple II computer was invented, and to me that was just the coolest way of telling a story on screen, that I could actually do at home without any special skills. It was beyond my means to do an animated movie or a live-action movie that would be any good. But I could do a computer game that would be pretty good. Within that, create a story in a world that people who played the game could then experience and enjoy.
His interest in creating games and storytelling carries over into college.
I went to Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, and I ended up majoring in psychology. But mostly what I did during my 4 years of college was go to the movies and program computer games, which really cut into studying and so forth.
It's not long before Mechner's talents are discovered by a publisher called Broderbund.
Broderbund was probably the biggest software company of that time. And I mean, they were publishing all kinds of games. So if you were a game maker at that time, being hooked up with Broderbund was a pretty significant deal.
While still a college student, Mechner goes to work on his first game for Broderbund.
My first game, Karateka, one of the things that inspired it were the film studies classes that I was taking at the same time. It seemed to me that games were kind of at a stage where silent films had been at the turn of the century. For that reason, Karateka was structured very much like a silent movie. And there were a lot of technical limitations that games had at that time, which silent movies also had. Characters couldn't talk, you couldn't really move the camera.
Karateka comes out for the Apple II in 1984. It sells 500,000 copies.
During my senior year, Karateka was published and did very well. So when I graduated, instead of getting a regular job, as most of my friends did, I thought, well, I'll just do another computer game.
Mechner graduates in 1985. 1 year later, he begins work on a new project. He finds inspiration in a famous silver screen archaeologist.
There's a scene in the first 10 minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark where Indiana Jones is running towards the ledge. He jumps and he misses it, but he grabs on. He grabs a root, and he pulls himself up and rolls under the gate just as it's closing. I mean, that kind of suspense, I wanted to get that into a game.
Mechner wants to combine the feel of a movie he loves with an Arabian setting similar to 1001 Nights. The result is a 2D action-adventure game called Prince of Persia.
In many ways, Prince of Persia is kind of like a sequel to Karateka.
Prince of Persia took the same fluid animation and very simple, emotional, melodramatic story and combined it with kind of a modular, traps-based environment.
His whole view of the thing was to really incorporate the story into the gameplay rather than, stopping the game and then showing some story and then continuing with the story. He really wanted to roll that all into one thing.
The challenges of making a game like Prince of Persia are daunting, but Mechner is determined to bring his vision to life. By 1986, Jordan Mechner is living in California and working hard on his newest game, Prince of Persia. Like many developers of his time, he must wrestle with limited technology.
One of the biggest limitations in the earlier stuff is definitely sound. You hear about composers making music for systems in that era, and it was really like composing with one hand tied behind your back.
Well, the big problem on the Apple II with music was that the computer was only capable of playing one note at a time. My dad was trained as a classical pianist when he was young, so I asked my dad if he would compose the music. First for Karateka, and then for Prince of Persia.
Mechner uses a new technique in animation with the help of his 15-year-old brother, David.
Jordan Mechner apparently took a lot of video footage of his brother jumping up and down and running around, hanging on ledges. After that, he basically was called rotoscoping, and he rotoscoped his brother's movements. And he really studied that very, very hard and tried to really emulate almost perfectly his brother's movements.
I wanted to create a character that would have weight. When you were running, you had momentum, and if you then pushed the joystick in the other direction to turn around, the character's arm would kind of flail behind him, because it's hard to turn around when you're running that fast in one direction.
The whole breakthrough in terms of technology, which is the rotoscope, helped everyone to gather around this magnificent character who was the very first one to be so well animated.
As Prince of Persia gets closer to completion, Mechner's talents become more and more apparent.
Jordan was a master in game design, level design ingredients, building the right learning curve, the right difficulty curve.
The time limit on Prince of Persia is what kind of heightened the whole experience of the game. You're sweating, you're wondering if you're gonna make it or not. You have no weapon, and you gotta find the weapon, clock's still ticking. The whole time, the game has this incredible tension.
The most appealing thing was how simple all the elements that Jordan managed to bring together to create such deep emotions.
And the AI of the enemies was also pretty advanced for a game like that. I mean, you were out in a full-out sword battle with these guys. It wasn't just like hack slash and then they're out of your way. You engaged in kind of a lengthy sword battle with these guys and hoped to put them away just in time for you to keep going.
Broderbund releases Prince of Persia for the Apple II in 1989.
It's funny, the big worry with Prince of Persia 1 was because I programmed it on the Apple II, and when it came out in '89, the Macintosh had already been introduced. It didn't seem like very many consumers were ever going to see it, simply because Apple II games weren't really being bought in stores anymore. What really saved Prince of Persia was the console versions that came out in the following years.
The first Prince of Persia game is a huge success, not only because it created a palette for the rest of the video game industry to work off of, but also it was ported to so many different systems, and there were people playing that all over the place.
Prince of Persia will go on to sell 2 million copies. Meanwhile, Mechner decides to take a break.
And at that point, I'd spent a good part of my youth writing computer games, and I was kind of eager to get out and experience the world and have adventures and so forth outside of the industrial park in Northern California, where it seemed like I'd been forever. So I went back to New York, went to film school, then I lived in Paris to make a film.
But he doesn't step out of games completely.
When Broderbund came to me, wanted me to do Prince of Persia 2, my first reaction was, no, I don't want to program another game. It's too hard. It takes too long. We were able to work out an arrangement whereby I didn't have to program it. I would just come up with a story. I would do storyboards, and then they had their own team of engineers and artists who would do what I saw as the hard work, which I had to do on Prince of Persia 1. So this was great because I was actually living in Paris, and I was able to send back and forth everything they needed to keep working on the game.
Mechner spends the next 4 years shooting a short film and working on a sequel to Prince of Persia. Prince of Persia, The Shadow and the Flame comes out for the PC in 1993 and outsells the original. In 1997, Mechner branches out and releases an adventure game called The Last Express. The game is praised by critics, but sales are sluggish.
So it was kind of this bizarre labor of love, this project that took us 4 years to do. And ultimately, there was not a huge market for adventure games in '97, especially adventure games that took place in 1914 on the Orient Express. The game is beautiful. I love the project. I think all of us who worked on it are very proud of it, but it didn't have the kind of success that the Prince of Persia games did.
With the disappointing performance of The Last Express, Mechner feels like he's done with games. On September 17, 1999, Red Orb Entertainment releases Prince of Persia 3D for the PC. A Dreamcast port is also made, called Prince of Persia: Arabian Nights. Mechner's involvement with the games is minimal.
I went on from Last Express to write movies